Hi, everyone. This is Rob Gray from ASU and the Perception and Action podcast. And this is another special video I'm making of a presentation I'm going to give for Patreon supporters of the podcast. And this is a presentation that I'm going to be doing for a local baseball team here in the Valley in the coming days. So, in baseball, I think we're at a really exciting time of opportunity, right? We have all this information we can gather, for example, about the parameters of ball flight, like launch angle and exit velocity, that produces the best performance. We have all these things we can measure about pitching, like spin rate and movement and so on, that I think we have a really good opportunity to use this information to guide skill refinement and technique change in really skilled athletes. But for this to work, I think it needs to be guided by the principles of effective coaching and motor learning. We can't just run off willy-nilly trying to change athletes and make them increase their launch angle, for example. We need to have some principles or it's not going to work. And the main message that I want to try to sell today is that coaches need to think in terms of a system, right? In every sport, in baseball, for example, all athletes are bound by this system, right? The system formed by the athlete themselves, the individual characteristics they bring to the table, physical characteristics or mental characteristics, the characteristics of the task they're trying to perform, whether it's hitting or pitching, and the environment whether they're performing it in depending on the weather, with windy, sunny, so on. And since athletes have to live in this system, I think as a coach you need to be there too. You need to be thinking about all of these things when you're training, no matter what you're training, instead of trying to separate them, right? Often in training, what we do now is we try to pull the athlete out of the system and train them completely separately from the context. And as an example, what I see often in the way that we train now, for example, is we tend to keep these two things in completely separate training categories, right? On the one side, we have strength and conditioning, which focuses on the capabilities of the athlete, their physical strength, their speed, their coordination, and so on. And then on the other side, we have skill training, designed to make them hit and catch and so on, and focusing on motor learning. And as I said, we tend to keep these two things separately. But I think that's really something that needs to be changed, right? The way things should be is these two things need to overlap in the way we train. And the reason I believe that is because they directly affect each other, right? So what we're doing in skill acquisition, what we're doing in strength and conditioning, in developing the action capabilities of our athletes, is going to have a direct effect on how they develop skillful movement patterns, right? When you increase the speed of an athlete or increase their strength or increase their flexibility, you're creating new opportunities for action, which are going to shape the way they acquire skills. At the same time, going the other direction, the action capabilities that we're developing in strength and conditioning need to be specific to the task constraints and the movement problem the athlete is solving, right? Developing, strength and conditioning drills that are out of context and are not specific to the sport are really not going to have any transfer and help the athlete on the field. They're just kind of waste of time. They're just doing. Time could be much better served. So what I want to talk about today is a few ideas for how these two specifics about how these two things can help each other, kind of movements in these two directions. So the first thing I want to look at is applying some of the principles from S&C to skill acquisition. And really I want to talk about three things that are done well in S&C that I think we need to adopt in skill acquisition training. Periodization, overload training, and adaptive training. So if we look at periodization of skill acquisition, one of the things I think we really need to think about more in coaching and training is what is the function of each practice we're doing, right? In each practice, is our goal to make athletes perform well in practice so they look good and everything's running smoothly? Or is it for them to learn and acquire new skills? A point is often missed is those are two very, very different things, and practice needs to look very, very different for those things. Often I see practices where people are, trying to do new things, and it looks like a dance recital, right? Everyone knows exactly where to be at exactly the right time, and it runs off perfectly smoothly. But that's not learning, right? Learning is messy. Athletes have to make mistakes and not know everything that's going to happen at every moment. Things need to be variable. We also need to consider the other two things shown there, consolidation and retention, right? You need to give athletes time to consolidate the new things you're teaching them, right? You can't put in too much. And also we need to consider transfer and adaptability. Are the things I'm teaching the athlete here going to allow them to adapt to unpredictable conditions that happen in any sport, right? When I'm teaching them how to field a ball, are they going to be able to adapt to a weird situation with runners on base that they've never encountered? Okay, so those are some things to consider. And this is really important because it helps to determine the ways that we organize practice. And when we talk about that, there's really different categories that have been used to describe how you can organize practice. And this is in terms of the variability of the different skills you're going to practice. So here are three kind of categories that are used a lot in research called blocked, random, and serial. So blocked practice is where you have an athlete practice one thing over and over again. For example, pitching. You do several repeats of pitching. Then you switch to a different skill. For example, fielding. You do that for a while, repeat it over and over. Then you switch to throwing, skills, throwing to a base. Okay, so that's blocked practice. Random practice is where you randomly switch between different things. Okay, so you do one rep of fielding, one rep of pitching, one rep of throwing. Okay. The last category that a lot of people aren't aware of is serial practice. So serial practice is when you switch between things, but in a very predictable order. And also, you can often do it in the order that it actually occurs in the real event. So, for example, in baseball, we could do having a pitcher practice pitching, then fielding the ball, then throwing to first, right? That's the order that it happens in the game. So that's the different ways to organize practice. Another way we can think about organizing practice is whole versus part practice. So in hitting, whole practice is when we ask the athlete to do the whole action. So do the wind up, the follow all the way through the follow through. Part task practice is where we split this apart. So maybe we'll only have athlete practice the leg kick, or only practice up to the point of contact and not follow through. So that's part versus whole practice. Let's look at some general guidelines of what research has shown about these different types of practice. So this is a famous finding from Shea and Morgan in 1979 that's been replicated in a lot of different studies. And basically it shows that having some form of variability in terms of the conditions you're practicing is very beneficial because it promotes this thing called contextual interference, right? The skills you're learning are interfering with each other, and by doing that, it's actually making things stronger, okay? And in this slide, you can see here, this was comparing a random group versus a blocked group. So remember, blocked is practicing the same thing over and over and over before switching. Random group is switching between things a lot. What you can see is the random group struggles in practice, right? They learn at a slower rate. So this is total time, so lower is better. Whereas the blocked group does pretty well right away. Again, learning is messy, right? So looking bad in practice is a good thing when you want to learn. So we have this pattern. When the key part is shown over here, when they come back, if you look 10 days later, what you can see is if you take the blocked group and put them in a blocked condition, they do fine. Okay, so if you have them train the way they train, test them the way they trained before, they do fine. But if you put them in a random condition where things are varying and things are changing a lot, which is probably what's going to happen in the real sport, they do terribly, right? So you can see they fall apart. Whereas the random group can handle both conditions. So having some variability in your practice, order of conditions seems to be very important. But there's kind of a qualification to this, and I'll get back to this in a little bit later, is that when you take this to the field, it kind of gets weakened, this effect. It really depends on the skill level and the age of your athletes, right? Higher skilled athletes. So this is a data from a meta-analysis, and it's showing kind of effect sizes. And you can see the effect sizes are smaller with kids. So kids, younger athletes seem to be able to handle less variability. And it also depends on the skill levels. Random versus block practice, the difference is less for highly skilled athletes. So, but those are some basic findings in the area. Another look in terms of the part versus whole training, really whether you can break a skill apart depends a lot on whether the action involves sequential movements or movements that happen simultaneously. So if you can break a thing apart with a clear division, then part training could be effective. Okay, so a good example in baseball is pitch recognition. So in baseball, when you're trying to pick up whether it's a curveball or a fastball, that is usually complete. It needs to be complete before you really start swinging, right? You start your full swing. So those things happen sequentially, so they can be broken apart effectively. But still, you want to put them back together quickly, right? And I'm going to talk about this more a little bit later, right? Even if it works, you need to put it back quickly. And I would recommend, if you're going to do a bunch of pitch recognition drills where people are watching videos and just saying fastball, curveball, follow that up where they're actually hitting, okay? So that is when part task training can work. Where it doesn't work is when things are happening at the same time. So if you try to practice just the upper body movements of a swing and have them do no lower body movements, that would be a bad idea, because lower body movements and upper body movements happen at the same time, right? So they need to be adapted together. So breaking it apart and doing part task training in that situation's probably not a good idea. There might be some situations where it might be effective, but in general, not very good. So these are some of the basic principles of variability of practice and how to organize practice. In terms of periodization, I think there's some kind of basic things we can think about, is going back to those goals of practice, right? So I think we can schedule, the types of things we want to do based on the where we are in the season. So in the off season, what we really want to focus on is learning, right? We want to focus on getting messy, having that randomness and high variability. We want to perturb conditions, right? Maybe add pressure, do overload, which I'm going to talk about in a second. And the phrase that we sometimes use is comfortable chaos, right? You want to have things really hard, difficult at a certain challenge level, and things going on, varying things, but not too difficult. So that's where the comfortable comes in. So that's in the off season. As we get closer to the actual, competition, or even within a game, I think we want to move more to having the goal of training being performance, okay? Having the athlete feel good in practice because they're performing well. Make them feel confident, have high self-efficacy, retain their skills, pressure-proof them, okay? And this is when you want to have maybe more blocked practice and lower variability practice, and make sure your drills are specific to the sport, right? You're not doing any kind of crazy wacky other drills, right? You want to do the actual sport. So I think that's kind of a good general framework. One of the things I wanted to mention before I finish this section is, I think a good thing we need to do moving forward, going beyond this, is actually move away from these categories I just mentioned, this blocked and random and serial, and start just calculating the actual amount of variability in the practice we used. And this was a good paper from last year by Tim Buzzard and colleagues from Australia, showing that we can calculate the amount of between skill and within skill variability, okay? And we can do this. The real advantage of this is you can do this for any type of practice you're already doing, and you can measure how much variability you're actually using. You don't need to put people into discrete categories. You're going to do blocked and you're going to do random. Let me show you an example. So here's an example they use from tennis. So between skill variability is when you practice different skills. Okay, so in tennis, a serve versus a backhand versus a volley, those are all different skills. Within skill variability is when you practice a different variation of the same skill. So a serve to a different side of a court, hitting a different pitch type in baseball, right? And for each kind of skill, you can calculate where it falls. Each practice drill, you can calculate where it falls on the between skill and within skill variability. Okay, so even if you don't want to change and manipulate variability in your practices, I think this was a good thing. This would be a good thing to track. Just another statistic you can keep track of how much variability you're using and how it relates to the development of your athletes. So the first kind of general practical tips I would give from this section is that skill acquisition needs a periodization framework too. We need to track athletes longitudinally. They develop things at different time scales. We need to consider varying the complexity of practice systematically based on the training cycle, just like we do in strength and conditioning. And I think the strength and conditioning and physical training research provides a great starting point for doing this. Okay, so that's the first point I wanted to make. The second thing I wanted to talk about that I think we can take from S&C that's a really valuable principle is overload training. Okay, so I want to give you a couple examples from my research. So this is a research study where we looked at what happens when you give batters, suddenly give them a heavier bat weight. So what we did was have batters hit, and this was in a batting virtual reality. We had them hit, and so we had one group that had the same bat weight the whole time. This is the timing error of their swing, whether they were late or early. Then we had another group on the third block. We gave them a heavier bat that they had to adapt to. And what you could see is batters initially struggled. Swing was late, and they quickly adapted. But what was interesting was when we looked at, so we overloaded the weight of the bat. But what was interesting is we looked at how they adapted. So we looked at the bat speed, okay, a measure of bat speed, and what we found is we get, it goes down when you give the heavier bat, then it quickly goes up. We also looked at the timing of the swing, okay. What happens is you get no change when you actually give them a heavier bat, but then you get swings going earlier in the next block as they adapt. But what I want to emphasize here is not the actual points in the graph, but the actual bars on them, right? Those bars are showing variability, so how much people are varying within participants. And what you're seeing is a huge amount of within participant or between participant variability. So the hitters in our study, which were college baseball players, were doing a lot of different things, right? Not everybody was doing the same thing. That's why those error bars are so big. And what we found is when we dug a bit deeper is that what people were doing depended on their action capabilities. So what we did was use a method developed by Terry Bayhill and Freitas to measure people's ideal bat weight based on the bat speed they could generate. And what we found was that depending on that recommended bat weight totally determined how the players adapt to our overload. If they could handle a high bat weight, okay, because of their physical capabilities, they adapted by just swinging faster. If they couldn't, okay, they adapted by adjusting timing. Okay, so we're getting these interesting individual differences in how people adapt to overload. And this really follows nicely with a principle in motor learning we call degeneracy. Okay, degeneracy is the idea that there's multiple ways to achieve the same thing. Okay, functionally equivalent actions in sport can be achieved by lots of different ways, right? You can adapt to a heavier bat by swinging harder or swinging earlier, for example. And it's really going to depend on the individual capabilities of your athlete. The other thing that we do a lot in terms of overloading athletes is adding pressure, okay? And this was a study that we did with pitchers, okay? And what we did is, so we add pressure in terms of performance incentives, in terms of monitoring effects. So we offer money for performance, and we also videotape people and kind of put crowd in the way and things like that. And what we found is that adding pressure is a good way to identify dysfunctional movement variability and instability in movement in your athletes. And what we did was we looked at kinematic variables that previous research has shown to be related to expertise. For example, the standard deviation of your elbow angle, the standard deviation of your body angle relative to the midline of your body, and things like that. And what we found is these are the things that kind of started to increase in variability when we put pressure on people. So kind of the practical tip from that is overload is a really effective way to understand your athlete, this system, the action, task, environment system. When you perturb at the action boundaries of your athlete, by adding weight or making them perform things faster, you can you change the constraints, or you can add pressure. It's an effective way to assess an athlete's adaptability. And the movement solution they're going to come up with when you overload them really depends on their individual capabilities. And if you don't like that solution, that's something that can be addressed in strength and conditioning. The last thing I wanted to talk about in terms of taking good S&C practices into skill acquisition is adaptive training. This is something that I think is done really well in S&C, but we don't do as well in skill acquisition. No, adaptive training, is just kind of secondhand for a personal trainer or person doing S&C. You quickly see what the person can handle. You change it so you're pushing them at the right level, but not too hard. I want to show you an example of how I incorporated these kind of principles in a study that I published last year using batting VR. Okay, so what I did was use this. Over several years, I developed this virtual reality for baseball batting, which is a large screen projection of a pitcher, motion tracked bat, and so on. And this was actually a study that took me over 10 years to do, and you'll see why in a second. So the technology we use now in my lab has actually improved a lot. Now we're using head-up displays and the Oculus and that kind of stuff. But what we did in this study, this was a study with a group of high school baseball players. And what we designed the study to be is, what I wanted to do is not replace what they're doing in real batting practice, right? But I don't think you can ever do that. Real batting practice will always be better than anything else you can do with any technology. So what I wanted to do was to use the VR to do things that are impractical in the field. And one of those is adaptive training. So what's shown over here on the right in this graph here is what we did, for example, is adapt the pitch speed the batters were facing based on how well they're performing. So if they're getting a lot of hits, we increase the speed. If they're struggling, we decrease it, and so on. And this is called a staircase method. And what we used is to find the right speed to challenge them in practice. And when we reached that level, we held it there for a while. If they started to get better, we did this testing again to come up with a new level. So we could quickly adapt the speed. We also did this with the pitch location, the variation in pitch types, and so on. And this allows us to do adaptive training. It also allowed us to do a much higher degree of variability in practice conditions than you can in real batting practice. So think about what you'd have to do with a pitching machine to vary speed over a big range and do over a big inside, outside, high, low pitches, curveballs, right? So we can do this immediately in the VR. And a lot of this was to get the athlete practicing near what we call in skill acquisition research the challenge point. So right at the point where you're pushing them a little bit, but not too hard. So this is a group that in the slides I'll show you in a second is called the VE Adaptive Group. So the Virtual Environment Adaptive Group. And what we did this was we compared this to 3 other training groups. So these were high school baseball players that were training with their team. There was a group that just did no extra training, so that was a control group. We had a group that did more real batting practice, so we took them to a cage every week and got some extra batting practice. Then we had a third group that did batting practice in the virtual environment. So they didn't do all this adaptive stuff. They just hit very like you do in a normal batting practice where speed's not varying very much and you're hitting the same pitch type for the most part. You're doing kind of blocked practice. So let's look at some of the results we found for this. What we found is after training, okay, so what we have there is the pre-training, post-training, and a retention test a month later. After training, we found the batters that did this VE adaptive training had more hits in both the virtual environment and an on-field test we gave them with a pitching machine than the other 2 groups. Interestingly, we also found they had some good underlying processes. So this is O swing percentage, which is, if you don't know, is the number of swings batters take at pitches outside the strike zone. So you want this to be low. And you could see the VE adaptive group had a nice drop in this after training that was much bigger than the other two groups. We also gave them a pitch recognition test, and they performed better. They performed better than the other two groups as well. So that was some encouraging findings. Why did it take us so long to conduct this study? Well, we did a couple extra things. What we did is after all this training and measurement, we let them go play their senior season for high school, and we measured their on-base percentage for the senior season, and we found that the VE adaptive group was higher, significantly higher than the other three groups. We also followed them for the next 5 years. So we just kept track of them and saw where they ended up. And what we measured was the number of them that high school players in our study that went to a higher level of play than high school, whether it was junior college, in a professional level. And this is the number. These are out of 20. So 8 out of the 20 participants in the VE adaptive group went on to a higher level than high school. The comparable results were 1, 3, and 1. Okay, so I think this is pretty, some nice results showing the importance of, this adaptive training in how it can have an effect and how you can implement it using technology. Okay. So in terms of the practical tips from this, I think when you're using any kind of training technology, I think you want to try to use it to expand into things you can't easily practically do on the field. Don't try to just replace what's going on in the field. It will never be able to better than what in real practice, okay? And a couple of things, focusing on increasing the variability of condition and quickly adapting to keep performance at a challenge point. Okay, so next I want to move on to, so that's kind of the S&C to skill acquisition direction. Now I want to go the other direction. How can we use principles of skill acquisition to inform strength and conditioning? And for this, I want to talk about 3 things: effective cueing, talk about the constraints-led approach, and then talk a little bit about specificity in training. Okay. So in terms of cueing, when we look at the performance of great athletes, right, a Jose Altuve, we can come up with really nice post hoc descriptions of what they're doing, right? Arms bent, front leg braced. One of the things that I think we need to be careful about, though, is separating movement description from movement instruction, right? The way that we describe effective movements is maybe not always the best way we want to cue them for an athlete to get to that point, right? And so what I've tried to do over recent years is to develop a taxonomy of the hitting cues that coaches use for hitters. And there's kind of a different kind of levels and different categories we can put cues in. Okay, so the first thing we can look at is the type of cue. So there's 3 basic types that we talk about in research. An internal focus cue is something that refers directly to your body. Okay, so throwing your hands at it, getting the lead foot down. An external focus cue is where you refer not to the body but something in the environment, whether it's the bat or the ball or the field. Okay, so you're getting them to focus away from their body. An analogy or a holistic cue is a cue where you're trying to use something in real life that people recognize to get them to produce the movement you want. So, for example, to get people to produce kind of the back leg push off in hitting, I've heard some coaches use the expression squish the bug, right? To get you to kind of make that twisting movement. Another category we can think about in this taxonomy is the distance we're referring to. So how close is the cue to the body? Okay. So when we're talking about pull the knob to the hip or driving off your backside, those are really referring to things close to your body. So we call those proximal cues. Distal cues is when we get you to focus on something further away. So focusing on the pitcher, focusing on the ball. A couple other things we can categorize as direction, okay? So direction, we can focus on driving you towards something, okay? Driving you towards the point of contact. I know I've often heard the expression, the A to C hand path, which I never quite understood what that meant. Away cues push you away from something. Pushing off your back foot, you're moving away. And the final thing is the goal of the cue, whether it's monitoring. Do you want your athlete to just kind of pay attention to what's going on, like feeling pressure, feeling the tightness in your grip? Or is it your cue designed to get them to take control over something, control over the movement? So all these, I think, are different categories. And what we found in our research, and this is supported by a lot of research, but I don't think it's as cut and dry as sometimes it's made out, is that cues, the optimal cues depend on the skill level of the athlete. And this is a study we did some time ago where we looked at college baseball players versus lesser skilled players. And we looked at the timing area of their swing again. And what we found is that for expert batters, external distal cues seem to result in the best performance. So a cue referring away from your body for a further distance. And you can see the internal cues did quite poorly here. Whereas for a lesser skilled performance, external proximal cues seem to be the best. Okay, so the effectiveness of the cue depends on both on the skill and on the skill level of the user. Okay, so the practical tip I would give you from this is, I think it's really valuable to sit down with your staff and yourself is try to think about the cues that you use and try to put them into this taxonomy. No, I'm not trying to say that you have to this cue, get rid of this cue and try that type, but I think it suggests possible opportunities for adding things, maybe some types of cues you're not using. As I said, in the research, you'll see a lot of people, really strike down against internal cues, and sometimes I give that message myself too. I kind of waffle back and forth, right? When I talk to coaches that I hear them having a lot of success with internal cues, it doesn't really agree with the research. But at the very least, I would say, think about expanding your toolbox by adding in external cues or analogies. And these are really simple things you can try that are slightly different, right? If you want an athlete to do something with their shoulder, instead of actually saying shoulder in your cue, try putting like a piece of tape on their uniform and referring to the tape, right? I want you to move the tape in a certain way. That's changing an internal cue to an external cue. And maybe, that's not always the best thing to do, but maybe for some athletes that will be easier for them, okay? And so I think it really, you need to try these different things, and I think it's like expanding your toolbox, as I said. The next thing I want to talk about is a kind of thing that I know a lot of people are getting excited about in coaching, the constraints-led approach. And to understand this, we need to think about how a lot of people have changed their thinking about how we acquire a skill in motor learning in our area. And the traditional approach to skill acquisition is the idea that there's one ideal technique, right? There's one way to hit. That's the best way to hit. What we do is try to teach an athlete to do that one thing through repetition. Try it over and over and over again. The coach stands there and is going to give you lots and lots of feedback and error correction. We're going to lose lots of internal bodily focus cues. You're lifting your foot too early. A key thing in this view is movement variability is bad, right? You don't want lots of variability in how the person is executing the skill. You want them to do it the same way every time. And also the idea that learning follows a linear progression, right? And that little diagram over there is the idea of what you're doing here is developing motor programs, right? These programs that your brain or the ghost in the machine can pull off a shelf to execute different actions. Okay, so that's kind of the traditional view that we've held for a long time. An alternative approach that a lot of people are moving towards is the idea that there's really no one ideal technique, okay? Each athlete needs to find their own individual optimal movement solution by satisfying the constraints from their environment, right? And you can notice that triangle over there looks a lot like the thing I started with, the system diagram, right? So the athlete is bound by their own constraints, the task constraints and the environmental constraints, and they develop a movement solution based on these, okay? When we're doing this, we want to give athletes less feedback and less correction and let them self-organize, right? Let them find their own solution. And you often hear the phrase repetition without repetition, okay? So we don't want them to focus on the same action over and over and over again. What we want to do is give them focus on performing the same skill in ever-changing conditions. So instead of hitting a ball right down the middle every time, we want to train them to hit a ball low and high and outside and inside and fast and slow and different types of pitches. Okay? In this view, movement variability is good. Okay? And we expect learning to be highly nonlinear, right? We're going to have peaks and valleys and flat plateaus in our learning. So this idea kind of has sprung out into a constraints model of learning that I touched on a bit from a person named Carl Newell. It's the idea that our movements are shaped by these constraints from the system. So in constraints-led approach, what you do as a coach is you manipulate these constraints to help guide the athlete to the solution. So we can manipulate the task constraints. For example, in soccer, we can reduce the size of the field or change the number of players on the field. That's changing the constraints and kind of pushing the athlete to maybe change their decision-making process or their passing process. So what I want to talk to you about now is talking about a study that I did looking at using the constraints-led approach for baseball. And what we did in this study was was in our virtual environment. We were looking at helping batters to increase a launch angle. And so what we did was we found a group of batters that are kind of suitable, I think, for this kind of intervention. They were batters that hit with a fairly high exit velocity for their level and had low launch angle. So they're hitting lots of ground balls. And the main constraint that we use is something that I know a lot of teams are already doing, is putting a barrier on the field. But what we did because we can do it in the simulation, is we used the staircase method. What we did was alter the distance of the barrier and its height based on your performance. Okay, so if the batter couldn't hit over the barrier, we moved it closer. Okay, if they could hit over the barrier, we moved it farther. Okay, again, we're finding this optimal challenge level. And we changed the height of it so they always had to produce a launch angle, I think it was 20 degrees, to get over the barrier. Okay, so here's what we found in the results. This is kind of the hit outcomes before training. So we compared the constraints group with an internal focus group, which was given kind of bodily focus instructions about how to increase launch angle, and an external focus group that were given kind of external focus instruction. These are showing the different categories of hits. Ground balls, so they're hitting mostly ground balls. Fly balls or line drives, and hardly any fly balls in the air at all. After training, what you can see is the constraint-led approach group massively increased the number of fly balls and home runs nicely, much fewer ground balls. The training worked a little bit, but was much less effective for the other two groups. And this is a study I'm going to have coming out soon, so I can give you more details if you're interested. Why did this constraints-led approach seem to work using this barrier? Well, what we did was what we actually looked at was looking at the bat path angle, the variability of this in practice. And what we saw is some very different patterns. So, for example, the internal focus group just kind of randomly moved around. The constraints-led group, what we found was increase in the middle of training that went back down at the end. So what I've argued is going on here is we're seeing what's functional variability. Okay, so that barrier is getting them to explore different swing paths. Okay, and they're doing that in the middle of training, and by the end of training, they're settling on something that's working. Okay, so I think the constraints-led approach is a really effective way, and we're researching this more and more. To use it effectively, you really need to be able to identify the requirements, the parameters of the specific skill. You know, the timing parameters, the spatial parameters. What is the limiting factor in the athlete? Like for launch angle, one of the main limiting factors I see is the feedback an athlete gets, right? In a batting cage, a hit with a good launch angle often hits the top of the cage, which is terrible feedback. And if they do hit it out in the field, you know, if you're not a professional that can constantly hitting over the fence, it's hard to get good feedback of whether you got the launch angle and the exit velocity combination you wanted. Adding constraints can be an effective way to kind of move this along. And if you're interested in this at all, I'd highly recommend, Keith David's book on the constraints-led approach. The last kind of thing I want to talk about in terms of the implications of skill acquisition for S&C is talking about specificity of practice. And to do this, I'm going to look at, a growing thing that I'm sure you've seen, aware of, is training technologies designed at improving the perceptual and cognitive skills of athletes. Okay, so making them think better, see clearer, focus on the right thing, make better decisions. And as I said, if you're aware of this field, there's tons of these on the market, right? And I'm showing a whole bunch here, right? I could literally sit here all day if I wanted. So we have VR, we have Halo Neuroscience, we have FitLight, we have NeuroTracker, we have Dynavision, and so on, strobe glasses, and so on. And I can't help but think if you're interested in this kind of thing, your only reaction could be help, right? How do I distinguish which of these have real training benefits and which of these are just snake oil? And so I want to give some points that I think are relevant here. The first one I want to mention is talking about face validity. So when you look at a training tool, I think you really need to stop and say, is the thing that's being trained with the technology actually what the athlete is going to do on the field? And as an example, these are 3 training technologies that I've seen people propose can be used to improve the performance of a quarterback in football. Right on the up here on the top right, we have Dynavision, which, if you don't know it, is a device where you stare at the middle of that board and lights come on in your periphery and you have to shut them off by touching them. Over here we have NeuroTracker, which is a much more recent intervention here. This is a fancy version of the shell game, right? It involves a task of multiple object tracking. So these little yellow balls move around the screen randomly. You're told to follow 2 of them, okay, and so it's really keeping your attention and eye movements and assessing that. Down here we have Madden Football, which I've heard people say actually helps them coordinate their movements on the field. So let's look at the face validity of these things. Right, first with Dynavision. In Dynavision, in NeuroTracker, what you're doing is asking the athlete to track random motion. But in sports like football, like a football quarterback, being an effective football quarterback is all about picking up structure in motion. Right? It's using the pattern of motion to recognize what defense is being played. Is it a zone or man-to-man or whatever? So the poor face validity, in my view, right? While being able to follow random objects is not the point. If we look at Dynavision is teaching you to react immediately to anything that suddenly appears in your peripheral vision. Do you really want your quarterback to be doing that, right? Your athletes to be doing that? No, I don't think so, right? You don't want your quarterback jumping at any time they see something in the peripheral vision. You want them to react when the right information is detected, right? When they detect a defensive lineman is broken by their blocker, for example. Then you want them to react, not every time. And the idea that you can learn skills from playing Madden football, is kind of low face validity again because there's no B button in real life. The other things I wanted to mention about this, one is I wanted to touch on the concept of generalized training. So generalized training is this idea that we can take skills out of their context, out of that system I talked about at the start, and train them separately. And a good example of this, along with the ones I've just talked about, is vision training, a lot of the vision training you'll see for sports. So these are 2 programs that have been around since the 80s, iRobics and Sports Vision. And they use lots of, rings and ropes and strings and balls to train your vision, right? So what we're training you with is abstract training. So we're trying to make you a better hitter, not by training you to see the ball better, but by seeing little strings and other little devices, okay? Can we actually do this? Can we actually take a baseball player off of the field, train them with these other things, abstract, out of context training, and get them better? Well, in my personal opinion, the answer to this is no, right? Even though this has been going on for 40 years, there's really no valid published evidence that you can do this, okay? And as an example, let me talk about one of the better studies in this area, one done quite a while ago now by Abernathy and Wood. And what they did was compare 2 of these training systems, iRobics and Sports Vision, for training to improve tennis performance. So what they did was measure on-court performance of accuracy of shots, pre-training and post-training for these groups. And what you can see here is this is what a typical study in this area does, right? You measure performance pre and post test on the training. And you can see, wow, it went up. This group went up by 10. This group went up by 5. Great, it looks like the training worked. But what this study has that most others don't is they concluded other conditions that allow us to properly evaluate this result. What we have here is a placebo group that just read a book about tennis and a control group that did no training at all. And what you can see is the placebo group actually went up more. They went up by 12. And the group that did nothing went up by 4. Okay? So when we see this, we know that this is not a real effect, right? It's not a real vision improvement. It's a placebo effect. Okay? We're getting the same result when we do nothing. Okay? So the problem with a lot of research in this area is that the majority of the studies don't include the proper control conditions to allow you to evaluate it. Okay? And you might say, Rob, well, all I want to do is make my athletes better, so a placebo effect is still an effect. Well, what I would argue is, some of these systems are pretty expensive, $50,000. If you want to get a placebo effect, I'll give you a lot easier and cheaper ways to do it. Okay, so this generalized training, I'm not personally a big fan of, and I think not only is this supported by sports research, but even more broadly, the failure of brain training, right? So you may remember Lumosity, which was a little app on your phone that you play these little attention and memory games, and it was supposed to help you in real life, right? Supposed to make you able to do your taxes better or remember where your car was. And as evidence that this doesn't work, Lumosity was charged by the FTC with deceptive claims because they had no support to prove their statement that it has any impact on real life. And here's one for a vision improvement one. A vision improvement app called Ultimize, kind of the same thing. And big review studies that have been published to look at this recently, again, support this idea. There's little evidence that this generalized, out-of-context training actually does anything. The last thing that I'd like to kind of point out about these kind of training in terms of specificity is perception-action decoupling. Okay, and this is a little bit going back to the part versus whole training I talked about earlier. So in normal life, our perception and action is always coupled, right? We make a judgment about the pitch type in order that we can swing, right? When we swing, we get feedback, a perceptual feedback that makes us change our swing next time. A lot of these training devices decouple perception and action, right? There's the Stanford VR that's used for training quarterback. What you do in this, if you've never seen this, is you use this head-up display to watch the movement of the players on the field, and you just say where you'd throw the ball. So perception and action is decoupled there. You're just doing perception without the action. This is generally not a good idea, okay? Because it can often result in producing completely different behaviors in your athlete. And here's a good example I like to use from a study by Matt Dix and colleagues. This was a study where they had an eye tracker on an experienced soccer goalkeeper to see where they looked when a kicker was about to make a penalty kick. The top is where they looked, so the circles are where they looked. The top is where they looked when they just had to say where the kick was going, left or right. Okay, so perception action is decoupled. The bottom is where they look when they actually had to dive and save it. What you can see here is you're getting a completely different pattern of eye movements. If things are different, I think it makes it really skeptical whether you're going to get any training benefits. Okay, so perception action decoupling can be done, for example, in pitch recognition. It can be done in the right way, but you really want to get things coupled again quickly. Okay, so you have to be careful about that. So the kind of practical tip from this is I really think SN3 training needs to be task specific. You can't pull an athlete out of this system, right, and just train strength or vision, or you really need to keep in mind what they actually have to do in their sport. You need to preserve the key task dynamics and the key perceptual information. And what we want is to strive for what we call representative learning design. Okay. In general, I think we need to constantly ask ourselves, why are we doing this exercise? Are we doing this vision exercise because it's easy to do? right? It's easier to sit in an office with string than go arrange a practice where batter's looking at a flight of a ball. That's not a good reason, right? We want to make sure we're actually having training benefits. So to conclude, I want to reiterate this message of the coach living within the system, right? This is a quote that I often use, that I like, from that James Gibson used. Ask not what is inside your head, ask what your head is inside of and attached to, right? You can't separate these things. So as a coach, I think you need to be an athlete, environment, task, system thinker. Okay, thank you.